Hello, thank you for being here today. My name is Ashley Grady. I'm the Senior Program Specialist in Smithsonian, which is the Central Office of Accessibility Services at the Smithsonian Institution. I'm a middle-aged white woman. I wear glasses, non-disabled, very excited to be here. And today I'm going to be talking about Smithsonian and our work at the Smithsonian Institution. So the Smithsonian Institution is comprised of 21 museums. Most are located in Washington, D.C., 14 education and research centers, a national zoo. We also have approximately 7,000 employees, more than 30,000 volunteers, and more than 2,000 interns every year. So we are one of the larger museum organizations in the world. And on the screen right now is a photograph of the Smithsonian Castle, which is the oldest building within the Smithsonian complex. It's currently closed for renovation, but this is a really nice picture from a somewhat sunny day. So moving into our work, the Office of Diversity is a central office, which means we get to work with all of the Smithsonian museums and research centers, as I alluded to on the previous slide. And Smithsonian is a branch within the Office of Diversity. We have 5 full-time staff in the Office of Diversity and 2 part-time contractors. So we are a relatively small office considering how large the institution is. Our office was founded in 1991, which was fairly recent, or came very recently after the Americans with Disabilities Act was passed in the United States. That's one of the largest pieces of disability legislation, and that became a law in 1990. So our office was formed pretty quickly thereafter. Our office is responsible for a lot of things. A lot of it has to do with policy development, thinking about procedures and implementation. But some of our biggest priorities are reviewing designs for facilities, programs, and new exhibitions that are going to be built in any of our museums. We also provide a lot of technical assistance, both to internal colleagues and also external colleagues, like some people that might be viewing this forum today. And when I say technical assistance, that could mean answering questions that we receive from visitors. It could be provide training, like is also on the slide, to a lot of our staff, our interns and volunteers, on disability etiquette, on accessibility services, on how to think about accessible digital technology. We also process access service requests. So these would be direct accessibility service requests that come from our visitors. Things like requesting American Sign Language for a public program, or providing pre-visit materials for people who are neurodivergent or autistic. Another major project that we oversee is managing our user expert group, which I'll talk more about in my presentation. The user expert group is comprised of adults that have all different types of disabilities, and we connect them to our colleagues in the different Smithsonian museums so that they can provide feedback on the accessibility of different exhibitions or programs. We also host many public programs for people with disabilities, and we also collaborate with the Human Resources Office and the Equal Employment Office. While Smithsonian tends to focus on accessibility services for our visitors, we are equally as concerned and informed about making sure that all of our employees and staff also have reasonable accommodations in place. So the mission of Smithsonian is that we are meant to be a catalyst for consistent and integrated inclusive design that provides meaningful access to the Smithsonian Institution museums and content for visitors with disabilities. On the screen right now is 3 members of our staff, and we are reviewing a new exhibition from a gallery in the National Museum of the American Latino, which is one of our newer museums. The most important thing about our mission are the 2 words consistent and integrated. When we're thinking about inclusive design, we never want people with disabilities to feel segregated or othered in any way. We want to think about consistent and integrated access to every Smithsonian exhibition, program, building, website, 365 days out of the year. And for Access Smithsonian, accessibility really is the minimum, meaning that's the baseline or foundational standard. For us, inclusive design is the goal. We want our colleagues in the different museums to be thinking more about how can I go above and beyond what's required of me. And when we get it right, inclusion is, practices and policies designed to, 1, identify, 2, anticipate, and 3, remove barriers. Most importantly, again, we want to anticipate and make sure that if there are barriers that are avoidable, we want to remove those in advance. Sometimes those barriers can be physical barriers, like needing to have a ramp to enter one of our buildings. Sometimes those barriers have to do with communication, like we might need to have assistive listening equipment for people who are hard of hearing or have hearing loss. And sometimes those barriers are attitudinal. And I think those attitudinal barriers around disability, whether it's misunderstanding, whether it's fear of disability, whether it's centuries of bias towards people with disabilities, again, we really want to try to remove those barriers at the Smithsonian Institution, because we want people with disabilities to have the individual ability to have full participation and benefit of the opportunities we have. And again, that key word or words are full participation. Oftentimes, people with disabilities are given a choice or an alternative option because things are not necessarily quote unquote accessible. And we really want to challenge our colleagues in the museums not to settle for an alternative option. We want them to have full participation. And on the screen is an image of a young boy who's a wheelchair user that's in a classroom setting. So thinking about how do we do this, right? How can a small office of 5 people work with more than 7,000 employees? And there are 3 main policies that we have at the Smithsonian. One is our Smithsonian Directive, which is titled Accessibility for People with Disabilities. And that directive has been in place for more than a decade. That's our main policy. The second piece of requirement that we have was developed in collaboration with the Office of the Chief Information Officer, which is our information technology office. And that is a technical note on website accessibility. We know that digital and web accessibility is very rapidly becoming one of the biggest and most important challenges that we're facing. So we try to work a lot with the Office of the Chief Information Officer. And then the third requirement, and these are more guidelines when we think about exhibition design, which are the Smithsonian Guidelines for Accessible Exhibition Design. These guidelines were originally published in 1996. And at the time, they were really the first set of guidelines for any museum thinking about accessible exhibition design. Those guidelines are still very much relevant today. They're absolutely a work in progress. We're hoping to release a new edited version in the next 2 to 3 years that will have a lot of new information about digital and web technology. So when we talk with our Smithsonian colleagues and they say, okay, we want to think about accessibility, where do we start? One of the first things I always do is point them to these 3 pieces of guidelines and policy so they can have a better understanding, the big picture about what we're talking about when we think about accessibility. But the rest of my presentation is going to be talking about how we actually train our staff to implement a lot of the procedures that are within these 3 policies and how we collaborate with our colleagues. So the Smithsonian museums have a lot of responsibility when it comes to accessibility. I think one of the most important things is changing this idea that the only people who need to think about accessibility are the people who work in the Access Smithsonian office, and that's just not true. We want all of our colleagues to prioritize accessibility in the same way they would prioritize security, privacy, cultural heritage, many other things. So we try to encourage our museums to, number one, budget for accessibility in their projects and in their programs. And sometimes this could be putting budgets in years before an exhibition will actually open. The second thing that we ask our museums to do is provide accessibility services for public programs. Those examples, again, are going to be things like American Sign Language or live captioning, verbal description, having social narratives or sensory maps for educational programs. There are times when we might assist our colleagues in reserving some of these services, or maybe even training them on how to create some of these services or materials. But for the most part, we want the museums to take the responsibility and ownership of accessibility services. The third thing that we encourage our museum colleagues to think about are creating accessible program materials and resources. And what I mean by that, so for example, if a museum is creating written materials and they're going to be saved as PDF files, we want those PDF files to be accessible for people who use screen readers. If they're creating a set of instructional videos that are going to live on their YouTube channel, we expect that those videos are going to have open captions, audio description, and a transcript. We understand, again, the practice and the development of knowledge and learning of how to do these things takes time. And that's why training is such a big priority within Access Smithsonian. We want to meet our colleagues where they are. We want to reinforce their efforts, and we want to help them gain and learn those skills that they need to prioritize accessibility, because there's no way that our Office of 5 could do all of these things for all 21 museums. The next responsibility and priority, and this has been a really, really big shift in the last 5 years, is develop inclusively designed exhibitions. I'll talk a little bit more in my presentation about how within accessibility, for many, many years in the United States, the focus was on specialized programs. We really want to think about exhibition design. We want visitors with disabilities to be able to come into any of our museums any day of the year that we're open and be able to experience all of our objects, all of our exhibitions, all of our content with that full participation and inclusively. We don't want them to have to schedule a tour 8 weeks in advance or travel out of state for a program that's only happening twice a year. We want them to have that experience every day. And that's where we have to get creative about inclusive exhibition design. And then the last responsibility, and this is where our office can be a liaison, is we want our colleagues to seek representation from the disability community, whether that representation could be within their own collections. It could be more inclusive hiring practices, so we're hiring more people with disabilities. It could be working with our user expert group and having them sit in on focus group discussions or prototype review sessions. Maybe they're reviewing new types of tactile experiences or things you can touch in an exhibition. Anytime we can create opportunities for people with disabilities to be at the center of conversations about accessibility, we're going to do that. So the departments that we support, and this is not an exhaustive list, this is just a few examples. Obviously, we work a lot with architecture and designers, digital and web developers, public program staff, exhibition staff, curatorial staff, advancement and fundraising. That's one that sometimes can be surprising to people, but We know that it can be very expensive, honestly, just to create exhibitions. And sometimes people's hesitation around accessibility is tied to funding. We should be fundraising for accessibility, for inclusive design. If an advancement department is already going to be going after major donations, we want to add accessibility and inclusive design into that budget request or into that gift request. We don't want accessibility to be something that we have to add on at the end. Obviously, we have to work a lot with administrative offices to make sure that paperwork goes through or that we have the contracts we need. We also need executive leadership support, education, special events, conservation, libraries and archives, and finance and contracting. This is not an exhaustive list, but I think it's important, again, to reinforce that in order for accessibility and inclusive design to be a priority and for disability to be a priority, we need colleagues from all of our museums, all departments, to be prioritizing accessibility. And now I'm going to talk about some of the ways we do that. So the four major focus areas that we work with our museums are physical. Obviously, that's going to be things like architecture, structure, buildings. And in some ways, those can be some of the more straightforward conversations. The standards are very clear about, how high things need to be for cane clearance or reach range, how high a table needs to be to make sure that someone who's using a power wheelchair is able to pull up both from a forward and a side approach. The next three areas, digital, programmatic, and exhibitions, can be a little bit more comprehensive. When we're thinking about digital accessibility, we're not just talking about websites. We're also talking about apps on our phones or smart devices, tablets, and we're talking about exhibition design and exhibition interactives. In the United States, touchscreens are very, very popular, and other types of digital media being used in museums. That media has to be accessible. And I think that this is where training and collaboration really, really comes into play, and creating opportunities for our colleagues from the museums to have people with disabilities test and review and be a part of the design process, so that we're thinking about digital accessibility from the beginning. We also think a lot about programs, whether that's live accessibility services, ticketing. Not all of the Smithsonian museums have ticketing or timed entry passes, but they all have public programs. So we have to think about, what does that reservation process look like? Is that accessible? Tours, are our tours accessible? Do we always have assistive listening equipment available for people who might need it? These are the types of things that we work a lot with our visitor services, audience engagement, guest services, and education departments on. And then that last focus area, which I've already talked a little bit about, is exhibition design. And it's everything from lighting to sound, tactile experiences, color contrast. Are we creating and writing accessible language on our labels, on our wall text? Do we have captions and audio descriptions on all of our videos? Exhibition design really is kind of the new frontier when we think about accessibility in museums. On the screen is an image from one of our user expert sessions, where one of our user experts is reviewing a tactile and braille map that goes alongside a digital interactive where it's a photography show, and the museum created tactile photographs that represent light pollution, so that someone who's blind and might not be able to see the photographs gets a tactile representation of what's in those photographs. The most common challenges that we tend to see in accessibility within museums, and this is very true at the Smithsonian, and This is where, I try to think about policy and procedure on paper are great, but what does that look like in practice? And where are those gaps? Where are we not meeting the mark where we should be? And the most common challenges are inconsistency. And that could be inconsistency from museum to museum, from exhibition to exhibition, from one disability to another disability. Even at the Smithsonian, someone who's blind may go to one museum, have a fantastic experience, and then go across the street to another museum and not have the same type of experience. And that's what we want to change. We want visitors to know what to expect. And that's, again, where we have to set that standard with our museum colleagues to try and create some type of consistent experience. Compliance only, that goes back to one of my earlier slides where we don't want our museum colleagues just thinking about the bare minimum and what's required. We want them to go above and beyond the minimum. One of the best examples I can give, in the United States for restaurants, there are sanitation or health grades to decide how clean and safe a restaurant is. And the grades are from the letter A, which is the first in our alphabet, to the letter F, which is the fifth or sixth letter. I always say that most people would rather eat at an A+ grade restaurant rather than a C-, which technically that C restaurant is a passing grade. The restaurant can remain open with a C grade, but we would much rather go to the A restaurant, which is the highest ranking you can get, the superior. And it's the same way with our museums. We shouldn't be settling for minimal compliance. Lack of resources is another challenge. We still struggle in the United States sometimes for funding when it comes to disability services, accessibility. When we think about diversity, equity, access, and inclusion as a whole, we're still struggling for resources and funding. Disability bias, there's still a lot of misunderstanding, and in some cases, not just unconscious, but implicit bias towards disability. And that's what we have to change. That's one of those attitudinal barriers that I talked about. So when I am working with colleagues across the museum, that's one of the biggest ones that we want to try to face head on in terms of those barrier removals. And then the fifth most common challenge that I alluded to a little bit earlier is a reliance on specialized programming. And what I mean by specialized programming is it became very common in the early 2000s for museums in the United States to have sensory-friendly Saturdays or tours twice a year, verbal description tours for people who are blind, partially blind, or have low vision, or to have 3 tours in American Sign Language per year. And while these programs can be fantastic and wonderful opportunities for engagement, enrichment, education, socialization, they cannot be the only option. What about the people who are coming from out of town and maybe they're not going to be in the area when that one verbal description tour is happening that quarter? That can't be the only way that they visit our museums. So that's where we really have to challenge our colleagues at the Smithsonian museums and in other cultural arts organizations to think beyond just the specialized programs. So some of the solutions that we offer for our colleagues, number one, we encourage people to work with our user expert group. Again, it's comprised of adults that have all different types of disabilities. So they're providing firsthand lived experience as a person with a disability, and hearing that feedback from a primary source in real time is the most beneficial and impactful thing that Access Smithsonian can do to help educate and motivate our colleagues. We work a lot with the different accessibility committees within the museum. So I mentioned that we're a small staff of 5, but most of the museums have accessibility committees. So we work with them. We want to hear what their goals are. Sometimes we want to review some of their strategic plans. Sometimes we'll do webinars or trainings, but we want to make sure that we're in the loop and that we know what's happening from museum to museum. I've talked a lot about providing training, education, resources, and documentation. We also review a lot of accessibility requirements for our contractors. And what I mean by that is the Smithsonian works with a lot of external vendors, partners, and organizations. And especially when we're thinking about design, we want the accessibility requirements to be written into those contracts. We want to make sure that our external partners are prioritizing accessibility as much as we are internally. And unless that language is in the contract from the beginning, there's always a loophole. So we really try to encourage our museums to think about adding accessibility into all contracts, and we help them review that language in advance. And then again, we also encourage our colleagues to include accessibility in their strategic plans. When we think about buy-in, how do we create support? How do we create momentum? If you add accessibility and inclusive design, diversity, equity, access, and inclusion into your strategic plan, it's more likely that the museum or your colleagues are going to prioritize it along with their other strategic goals. They don't have an out, if you will. They have to stick to what they set out to do. And on the screen right now is another image from one of our user expert groups. This is one of my colleagues who's reviewing a tactile replica of an object that's actually in glass. You can't see the object on the screen, and it's of a mail cart. This is from the National Postal Museum. And this is a good example of where a museum wanted to create a new way for access for people who are blind or have low vision. So I want to talk very briefly about what is a user expert. I've used this phrase several times in my presentation, but I think this idea, again, of how do we work with colleagues, how do we get them to understand the meaning of policy, how do we get them to implement the procedures that we're talking about, and the most important thing is to have disability community at the center of those conversations, as I've said. So a user expert is a person who's developed expertise by means of their lived experience in dealing with the challenges of the environment due to a physical, sensory, or brain-based functional limitation. And our user experts participate in, we call them contextual inquiry review sessions with our colleagues to advise on inclusive design. So for example, on the screen, one of our user experts is reviewing a digital interactive for the National Air and Space Museum. These sessions happen most of the time when the museum is open to the public. These are not simulations or hypothetical personas or scenarios. We want real people in real time using the real things. And again, we do that so that our Smithsonian colleagues can see in real time what it's like for someone to use or experience, whether it's a technology they've created, whether it's seeing if a navigation app is actually helpful. Maybe it's seeing if a digital touchscreen can be accessible using a keypad to navigate with audio description. The types of user expert sessions that we have really can vary from museum to museum, but I can't overemphasize the importance of having those disability voices in the room. So when we work with user experts, again, we're observing people in real time, we're avoiding simulations. The conversations are driven by what the user experts are saying. So this isn't standard evaluation where we have the same 15 questions that we ask for people in that exact order. When we're working with user experts, we want to follow their lead. We want them to experience something as they would in the museum, like anyone would. And we're going to ask them questions throughout the session. We're going to have a dialogue about what's working, what's not working. And these sessions really are meant to lead to practical applications and practical solutions for Smithsonian staff. They could have spent weeks and weeks and weeks developing a computer program to make a website accessible for someone who's using a screen reader. But until they see someone who is a native screen reader user accessing that website in real time, there are always going to be those bugs or those changes that we have to make. And not only are they going to make those changes for this website, they're going to think about that coding for future websites that they're designing. So it's meant to lead to ongoing prioritization of accessibility and inclusive design. And finally, just talking about 4 of the other programs that our office oversees at the Smithsonian that has helped other museums develop better understanding, better policy, better procedure around disability. The first is called Morning at the Museum, which is a, as we call it, sensory-friendly program. That's a very common term in the United States, sensory-friendly. That's often correlated with people who are neurodivergent, autistic, have intellectual disabilities, ADHD, amongst many others. And usually what we do is a museum will open an hour or 2 hours early for individuals or families that have registered in advance. This type of program is very common in the United States. I'd say it's probably one of, if not the most popular disability program in museums and in cultural arts in the United States. And again, these are great options. We've been running Morning at the Museum for more than 12 years at this point. However, we want to think about how are we meeting the needs of participants who aren't coming to those early morning programs. Maybe they live out of state. Maybe they're not able to join us that day. I've talked a lot about the User Expert Advisory Group. Another program that we run within Access Smithsonian is called See Me at the Smithsonian, which is a program primarily designed for adults with dementia and their care partners. There's an image on the screen from one of our programs where we have a group of seniors who came to the National Portrait Gallery, and they're being greeted by one of our museum educators and an opera singer. And See Me at the Smithsonian is less about being in our museums. These are mostly virtual programs where we really want people with memory loss or dementia and their loved ones, their caregivers, to just be able to spend time together, talking about art or history or culture or science. Museums can be places for socialization, and we know that a lot of caregivers can feel very isolated at times, especially if they're taking care of a loved one who has a disability. So the See Me program has really become an outlet for a lot of our participants. And then we also have a thriving disability employee resource group at the Smithsonian. It is staff-led by staff who identify as disabled, and it's a relatively large group at this point. They meet regularly. And the entire purpose of the Disability Employee Resource Group is to make sure that all of our employees and affiliated staff have everything they need to thrive in their work, whether it's reasonable accommodations, whether it's support from supervisors, support from leadership. We want to make sure that those employee resource groups are providing a service to employees across our museums. And I think with that, I'm going to conclude my presentation. Thank you so much for having me. It's been an honor to be here, and I look forward to answering some of the questions that you have. Thank you. Thank you so much. That's a great question to start. You know, in the United States, legal standards and regulations can be complex. We have the Americans with Disabilities Act, the Architectural Barriers Act, the Rehabilitation Act. Those are just some of the more impactful, more common ones that we think about. And while that legislation is not up for discussion, it's written into law. Different organizations, especially cultural arts organizations, can interpret certain aspects of that legislation to meet their needs. So for example, effective communication is a very common phrase I hear a lot in accessibility guidelines or standards, but the specific examples of what effective communication means can be very different. So for example, in a movie theater, effective communication could just mean open captions or an audio described version of the film, or having assistive listening devices for people who are hard of hearing or have hearing loss. However, in a museum exhibition at a Smithsonian museum, effective communication could mean so many different things. Essentially, how are we effectively communicating content of all of the objects in that exhibition? And that could be communicating content via tactile experiences, things that people can touch with audio description. It could mean, how are we relaying information from a touch screen that has no audio to people who are blind, partially blind, or have low vision? It could mean, are we writing labels that are accessible for all different types of reading levels? So I think that, you know, rules and standards, principles, policies are really, really important to set the foundation and the baseline. But they really can be shaped or interpreted to benefit whatever organization is working with them. And it does look different from country to country, and certainly even from industry to industry. Another very specific example in the United States, the Americans with Disabilities Act very clearly talks about the need for service animals, which have been trained to perform an individual task for a person with a disability. So all service animals are recognized and covered under the ADA. However, the Americans with Disabilities Act does not recognize emotional support animals as being service dogs or service animals, but state and local governments and sometimes museums or grocery stores or banks, airlines will allow emotional support animals, whereas other types of federally funded governmental agencies will not. So there definitely can be a lot of interpretation, but it's meant to, I think, help organizations make laws and legislation fit best for their organization. Great. That's another great question. And we try to work with all museums and departments across the museums. And I talked a little bit about that in my presentation, but I think over the last 3 to 5 years, our primary focus and our primary priority really has shifted to exhibition design. As I mentioned, in the United States, it's very common for most museums and cultural art organizations to focus on those specialized programs, sensory-friendly programs, verbal description tours, things like that. And again, while these are very important options, they cannot be the only choices for people with disabilities. And this is why Access Smithsonian, as a leader in our field, we're really trying to shift the focus to what we call everyday accessibility, meaning we want people with disabilities to be able to come into our buildings or visit our websites or attend a virtual program any day of the year and have full participation and access to content. There are definitely difficult conversations. Sometimes a really good example, historic preservation. a lot of Smithsonian museums are very old, and in some cases, making physical alterations or changes to buildings for accessibility purposes can be a really hard thing to do. It can be expensive, but it also, we want to honor the historic integrity of our buildings. So we have to work a lot with historic preservation. Another thing, I love that you mentioned, art museums and aesthetic, what's beautiful, what's appealing to the eye. Some challenges that we faced are maybe we have an artist who has a time-based media piece and they don't want to have captions. They don't want to caption their artwork for a variety of reasons, or maybe the artist is no longer living, so we can't have that conversation. That's where we have to get creative with the museums and start to think about how can we find some type of entry point for people who are deaf in that case, or hard of hearing or have hearing loss. And we want to, again, center disabled voices in our practice. The most important and impactful thing we can do is create opportunities for our colleagues to hear from disabled people. So when I think about accessibility being ranked lower sometimes, that's where I always default to bring in the disability community so that colleagues can hear from disabled voices first and foremost. That's a great question too. We do a lot of training. Sometimes it's in-person training, sometimes it's virtual training. But something that I'm really excited about that Access Smithsonian is working on is we are developing what we are calling an inclusive design curriculum. We understand that a lot of colleges and universities, these training programs that people are going through, they're not learning about accessibility and inclusive design, whether it's architects, curators, designers, developers. So we're trying to create a full curriculum, almost like a training academy, where we can work with colleagues from across the Smithsonian and help them learn more about accessibility and inclusive design. I think we're definitely a few years away from launching due to the small staff that we have. But in the meantime, we have also a pretty comprehensive resource library for our colleagues and staff. So in addition to that training that we do, we also have a lot of videos, articles, presentations that staff and affiliated persons are able to access on our internal website. We understand that we do this every day, but our colleagues don't. So we want to create education and learning opportunities for them throughout the year. That's a great question. So I think that one thing we know is that for decades, people with disabilities we're not historically visiting museums and cultural venues as often as their non-disabled peers. And a lot of that is because museums and just the world in general is inherently inaccessible. So we try to create opportunities where not only are we seeking feedback from visitors that we see with visible disabilities, but also visitors with non-apparent disabilities. And a lot of that work does come through our user expert group, which I talked about in my presentation, where we want to find out directly from the source, what are those challenges? What are those barriers? Why aren't you coming to our museums? And how can we change that? I think one of the most insightful pieces of information that I've heard from people with non-apparent disabilities, this was actually a group of people who are all neurodivergent or have intellectual or brain-based disabilities, all talked about the first thing they do if they're going to visit a museum is go to the museum's website and see if they have any type of accessibility information listed on the website. Is there parking? Is there a quiet room? Do they have pre-visit materials? And if there's not even anything on the website, or maybe it's very, very small tidbits of information, that has signaled to them, well, they're not thinking about us. You know, what are they actively doing for us? I'm going to have to potentially go to an unfamiliar environment, self-identify, or track down the right person to get the help that I need. Whereas if we have a museum that has a really, really robust accessibility page with all types of materials, information, contact information, people you can call, people you can go to for help. We've heard from a lot of people with disabilities that those types of resources really, really make a difference, in addition to the things that you would experience on site, like a verbal description tour or an ASL interpreter for a public program. So we really try to figure out what behind the scenes can make a more seamless visitor services experience, so that people, most importantly, people with disabilities, don't have to do the work. I think that's one of the most common things I hear from my friends and colleagues who are disabled. They're always the ones that have to do the work. They have to do the asking. We want to remove that. We want them to know exactly what we have, exactly what our commitment is to accessibility. And it's ultimately our job as the non-disabled employees and organizations to try to make those services more readily available. Absolutely. I think we could do another session next year just about digital accessibility. It is absolutely at the forefront of our practice. It has been for many years, but certainly during the COVID-19 pandemic, when we were all working remotely, we started to think about digital accessibility in a new way. How many webinars or virtual meetings or phone calls were we in where it was impossible to hear the speaker, but we had captions running, so we knew what was happening? Two very specific examples that come to mind in my work a lot are navigation and wayfinding, and also bringing digital interactives and technology to people who are blind, partially blind, or have low vision. We know that things like QR codes emerge every couple of years, and we see a lot of museums experiment with apps on their phones, tablets, devices. We also know that digital technology is always changing, and I can't tell you the number of times a museum created a really, really great digital solution for a problem, and then that software or technology was outdated less than 2 years later. So we had to either go back to the drawing board or purchase a new technology. But I do think that coming up with navigation and wayfinding solutions for all visitors, but visitors with disabilities, and navigation and wayfinding supports that they can access on their own device is really, really important, especially with smartphones and tablets. The accessibility settings that are built into our phones are very, very strong, and someone already has their own personal preferences of how to use that technology. So if we can create experiences where someone can use their own device to access information, that's going to make it more comfortable for people with disabilities. And then again, getting creative with those digital interactives in our gallery spaces. One of the fun ones we've been experimenting with is navigating touch screens by using keypads. Like if you were going to a restaurant, instead of swiping the screen, you would use a keypad to navigate through. And we're starting to experiment with some of those types of technologies in the Smithsonian museums as well. Thank you so much. I think that's a great question to end this talk on. And the most important thing for me is always, again, bringing in people with disabilities, having those individuals, those communities, those groups leading conversations. You know, even though the Smithsonian I do believe is a leader in terms of accessibility. We still have so far to go in terms of disability representation within our own staff, disability representation in our collections, in our objects, within our buildings. So I think that's, again, the number one most important thing we can do is elevate disability. We know that it's an identity that a lot of people are very proud of, and we've moved, or at least are starting to move away from this idea of a medical model where having a disability means there's something wrong that needs to be fixed. That's the exact opposite of the type of institution and organization that we want to be. Disability rights are civil rights, they're human rights. This is a social justice issue. So I think museums definitely need to find a way to elevate disability in a way that we're talking about it as just another identity that people are proud of. And then I do think as well, one other thing that is really important is innovation takes time, and also sometimes innovation and creativity doesn't always play out in the way we thought it would. And I think that's why it's really important to set realistic goals and achievable goals. If you're an organization that's trying to come up with a plan for accessibility, I always say, don't just create one 5-year plan. Create goals that you can achieve in 30 days, 60 days, 6 months, 1 year, 3 years, and 5 years. And the reason I say that is if you focus so much on the really massive changes that take time, you're going to lose momentum along the way. People need to see change and substance and metrics and outcomes faster. So, like, for example, one of the easiest things organizations can do is update their website. I talked about earlier how hearing from people with disabilities all of the time, having useful and practical accessibility information on your websites is going to say to them, we've thought of you, we want you to come, and here's what we have to make your visit as enjoyable as possible. That's a relatively small change that your organization can make in maybe as little as 30 days. Save those big, construction projects or massive equipment purchases for the 3 to 5 year plans, but really try to focus on how you can create better community with people with disabilities in your area.